Good morning and welcome to the Illinois Power Agency's workshop on the development of our next long-term renewable resources procurement plan, our 2022 plan. I'm Anthony Starr. I'm the director of the Illinois Power Agency, and we'll be getting started in just a moment. We are in the process of just making sure everyone gets admitted to the workshop. So we'll give it maybe one more minute and then we'll get started. Okay, let's get started. Again, I am Anthony Starr. I'm the director of the Illinois Power Agency, and welcome to today's workshop. Today's workshop is being recorded and closed captions are also on if you would, and you can turn those on or off if under the live transcript option at the bottom of your screen. Can we have the next slide, please? Today's workshop this morning's workshop rather, is the first of two workshops we're holding today as part of the agency's development of our next long-term renewable resources procurement plan. We have a number of topics to go through, and what I have listed here is our agenda for the day with some proposed times for how much we will spend on each topic at hand. We will try to go through things, take people's questions and comments, and then if we have additional time, we can circle back to things. So again, we have a number of topics this morning. We'll take a break for lunch and then have an afternoon session as well from 1 to 4 o'clock. Next slide, please. So as I had mentioned, today's workshop is being recorded and will be available on the IPA's website after we're done, along with the slides that we're presenting today. What our plan is for the workshop is to have a process where IPA staff will present on various topics that we have flagged for consideration, and then we'll pause to take comments and questions. Please use the chat feature if you want to make comments or if you wish to ask a question. If there is something you would like to clarify or have something slightly more interactive, please use the raise hand option, which you can find under the reactions option, and we can unmute you. Everyone is on mute otherwise. Next slide. The workshops today, what we're going to do and our goal for these workshops is to review the sets of questions that we released on Friday in a set of requests for stakeholder feedback that are available on the Illinois Power Agency's website. we released, I believe it was 8 sets of questions, and we're going to go through those. These are the things as we've thought about the development of the long-term plan. There's obviously hundreds of items to consider, but these are ones we're particularly interested in stakeholder feedback at this point in time in the development process. And I'll go into that in a little bit more detail in a moment. While we welcome and encourage comments today, ultimately one thing that is probably the most useful for us as an agency as we consider potential new content or changes or of things to reflect new provisions of the law for the long-term plan, that written feedback is really very helpful so that we can have things in writing and more details around proposals. So we really strongly encourage stakeholders to submit written comments. Those are due December 3rd, and please email them to the IPA contact us email address listed on this slide. If in the context of providing feedback to us, there's anything that you might consider confidential, you can also have the option of submitting a confidential copy as well as a redacted copy. We will be posting all comments received to our website. So that's important, that if there's something you want to share with us that you think will help us inform our development of our plan, you can certainly submit confidential information and we will treat it accordingly. Next slide, please. This morning, along with myself, presenting will be Brian Granahan, our Chief Legal Counsel. You've probably heard Brian and me on many of these workshops before if you've participated in previous IPA workshops and webinars, and several new staff as well. Doug Steiner is our Planning and Procurement Bureau Chief. He started a few months ago, filling the shoes of Maria Bojorquez, who had retired this summer. And Sharon Johnson is our Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Manager. She is on week 3 with the agency, a really important hire for our agency as we grow and develop and incorporate into our work some of the key goals of the Climate and Equitable Jobs Act. Helping us out this morning will be Megha Hamal, our Communications Manager, and Sarah Duffy, our Associate Legal Counsel. They'll be managing the questions and comments coming through the chat. So you may see their names showing up in the chat as well as we go along. Next slide, please. Just to step back for a moment, obviously, the reason we're here today is the development of our long-term renewable resources procurement plan. And we're on a cycle slightly different than we would have imagined several months ago, which I'll go into in the next slide. This all obviously flows from the Climate and Equitable Jobs Act, which passed the Illinois General Assembly in September and was signed on September 15th. Because it's such a comprehensive bill spanning so many different topics, one of the things the IPA has been doing is holding a set of what we call power hours. These are webinars to help just provide educational content and background. So unlike today's workshop, where the goal of today is to solicit feedback and comments on something, the power hours are really meant to be educational seminars on specific topics related to the implementation of CEJA. We've held 3 to date, the first 3 listed, and we have 4 more coming up over the next few weeks. So if you are new to our process or still trying to wade your way through the legislation and understand all the nuances of it, these webinars can be a very helpful educational tool to help understand some of the nuances of those. They're also available on our website, so you can either listen to them live or go back and listen to them later on if you aren't able to make them the day that they're being presented. Next slide, please. So in terms of context of where we are, the agency through 2017, when we thought about renewable energy procurements as part of the agency's work, that was always done through the same planning process that we did for the electricity we procure for customers who have not switched their electric supplier. One of the changes that came about from the Future Energy Jobs Act, the legislation that was passed in late 2016, took effect in June 2017, was that it separated out our work on renewable energy into a separate long-term renewable resources procurement plan with a model that it would be developed initially and then updated every 2 years. So we developed the first plan in 2017 and it was approved in 2018. Then the 2-year cycle led us to develop the next plan in 2021 and it was approved in early 2020. We had released a second revised plan in this summer, which was prior to CEJA passing. When CEJA passed, we withdrew that plan because we have a new provision that requires us to develop a new plan that incorporates the provisions that that the law now has and release it with 120 days. So that is the period where we are in now. Some of the things you'll see in certain slides as we move forward are that there are a number of issues that we had flagged for stakeholder feedback when we released the second revised plan over the summer that are things that are still places where we would appreciate stakeholder feedback. And so this is an opportunity for that as well. The way the process works is that the plan that we're developing will be published by January 13th, 2022. That's 120 days after CEJA took effect. There will then be a 45-day comment process. So that will be a second opportunity for stakeholders to weigh in. So today we're really looking at how getting some initial feedback as we're thinking about drafting that plan, things that will help us. But this is sort of your first bite at the apple. Your second bite of the apple comes during that comment plan process. So we'll take the feedback we get here, our own work and research, and develop a plan that we publish in January. Then there'll be an opportunity for you as stakeholders to comment on that plan. We will consider those comments and then use those to make further revisions to the plan as appropriate. And then we will file it with the Illinois Commerce Commission for approval in mid-March. And then it goes through a formal, what's known as a docketed proceeding before the Illinois Commerce Commission. That's really sort of the third opportunity for stakeholders to weigh in to that more formal process on things that they don't agree with in terms of what we propose in the plan, or potentially if someone else doesn't agree with something and you support what we do, there's obvious opportunity to come as the intervener and voice support for things. This all will wrap up with the Illinois Commerce Commission approving this plan in mid-July. And then the provisions of that plan will go into effect after that point in time. Brian, is there anything else you would want to add about the process, or if I hit all the key bases?
I think you've pretty much hit on everything. If anyone's curious, if they're new to this process, you can look up on the ICC's eDocket website some of the prior plan approval proceedings. So those would be docket numbers 17-0838 and 19-0995.
Great, thanks. And all of our previous plans are available on our website, the link at the bottom. So you can look through the previous plans and see what those look like. Next slide, please. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Doug Steiner, our Planning and Procurement Bureau Chief, for a set of questions. These initial questions are focused, couple about sort of budgeting and how we think about some prioritizations and the flow of funds, and then a specific question about community renewable generation that didn't really fit into any of our other topic areas. So it really is a place that we felt we could sort of kick off a high-level conversation about the role of non-solar community generation. So with that, Doug, it's all yours.
All right, thank you, Anthony. Good morning, everyone. Megha, you can go to the next slide. One thing the first topic we're going to discuss is the RPS budget and how that's going to be accounted for. To put this in context, the Act really established two criteria related to the long-term plan, and that is it established new targets for us to procure. And overall, we're essentially looking at procuring 10 million RECs by the end of 2021, increasing to 45 million RECs by the end of 2030. Now, to achieve those targets, the Act also increased the budget, the funds that utilities will collect from customers to procure these RECs. And essentially that budget went from $200 and some million a year to close to or approaching $600 million a year, a significant increase in money to achieve these goals. And the one element of the Act basically says in any given delivery year, if forecasted expenses are less than the maximum budget allowable, the agency shall continue to procure new renewable credits. until that budget is exhausted. And there's some significant challenges to this. First of all, the Act created new programs and new pricing for the RECs. Just as for instance, utility scale procurements we do now, the price that will be paid for those RECs will be indexed to an energy market. So essentially, it's a variable price that changes over time. So how do we forecast what those expenditures are? And that's in it of itself a challenge. So as we try to work through the development of this long-term plan, we'd like feedback on a couple areas. And here are the two questions that essentially we're looking for. Given the statutory guidance to maximize expenditures, regardless of whether the targets are exceeded, how can the agency best balance maintaining the integrity of the plan? Because essentially, we're supposed to maximize expenditures for the budget, but that could conflict with what the target amounts are for each of the various programs and procurements we have in place. So we'd kind of like some guidance or feedback on how to do this. And then the second question, how can we, giving these competing objectives, how can we balance this in any given delivery year? And in relation to that is, would this require any kind of midstream adjustment? If we find that somewhere during the year that we don't think we're going to meet or fully exhaust all the budget funds, should we make changes? Should we, what kind of adjustments should we make to the plan for the year, and potentially the quantities we procure, or what areas might we consider? So these are really two areas for the budget accounting that we want to seek feedback on. Maggie, you can go to the next slide. One thing we had proposed back in August when we released the revised long-term renewable resources plan was to utilize a 5% buffer between the expected collections and expenditures in a given year. And given that the size of the budget has increased significantly, we'd like to know if this buffer of 5% is still appropriate. And how should the agency consider the REC contracts, because some of the pricing is floating or indexed, as I mentioned before, on the utility scale programs? How should that be used in determining what an appropriate buffer margin might be? And then what's happened in the past, every 2 years, the agency updated a long-term plan. And in that 2-year cycle is when the agency published RPS budget numbers and procurement volumes, basically give a picture of how the programs and the dollars are being spent. Now, as we move into new programs, more aggressive targets, and higher budget dollars, the agency is looking to develop or enhance the website to provide more regular updates on the budget and procurement volumes. And we're potentially looking at doing that on a quarterly basis. We essentially would like to get some feedback on what would be the useful or informative information that stakeholders would like to see in updates or statuses of the RPS collections and expenditures on the website. All right, next slide. All right,
let's actually maybe pause there for any questions or comments on that, because this next slide is a somewhat different topic.
Okay.
There aren't any questions in the chat right now. Just a reminder, if you do have any questions or comments, please use the chat function and then I'll read them aloud to the presenters. But at the moment, we don't have anything.
Okay, great. And these are probably, these set of questions that Doug went through are probably the most abstract questions of the ones that we'll be covering today. So again, if you have thoughts on those, as please, maybe that's something for written feedback. And particularly on the last question, I mean, one challenge I know I certainly have is that we sit every day thinking about and looking at these sorts of things and are very familiar with the information and the nuances of things. And so in terms of thinking how we can present information about the status of the RPS, both the budget and procurement targets, it sometimes can be a little hard for us to sort of see what would people outside of the agency see as the most useful way for that information to be presented. So that's something that we are particularly interested in feedback on. How can we do a better job as an agency presenting information about the status of RPS on an ongoing basis? So the next topic that we are going to cover is non-solar community renewable generation. So there is a provision in the Act that we can consider whether or not to look at community renewable generation that is something other than solar. We obviously have well-defined community solar programs, both in the Adjustable Block Program and Illinois Solar for All. But the question is, are there opportunities for other types of renewable generation that could also work through the sort of community model of having a project that has subscribers who benefit from that project by getting basically equivalent virtual net metering credits from it. So in our first long-term plan, we had proposed a procurement along these lines and held a procurement, and there were no bids that were selected. One of the challenges we heard at the time was that at that point in time, the maximum size of projects was 2 megawatts. And there was some interest in potential community wind projects. But the economics of wind turbines obviously is one that scales with size. And one of the things that we heard was that turbines under 2 megawatts in size were not really economically viable, as turbine sizes have increased. So one question we have here is, now that the maximum potential size of a community renewable generation device could be 5 megawatts, does this make the model of wind community renewable generation viable? Or for that matter, are there other resources that qualify as renewable resources under the Illinois RPS's definition of renewable resources that we can consider out? So that's one fundamental question is, I mean, if this is something that just is not viable and is not interested in it, then we won't propose it. But if there is a potential for it, then this is something that we certainly want to take a look at. Another aspect of this is, what is the right mechanism to do this? We did this previously through a competitive procurement, much like we do for utility scale projects or brownfield site projects, but we could also conceivably think about a non-solar community renewable generation program that's more like the Adjustable Block Program with set rec prices and a different sort of enrollment process. So that's something else we'd be interested in, is what, if we do go down this road, what would be the right procurement model? Another question would be, what should be the scale of this, and what would be should be the timing of this? I'd imagine that these projects would take a while to develop, so this would not be a procurement we'd want to do right away after our plan is approved. How much time would be appropriate to allow potential developers to develop projects before we open up a program, whether it's a competitive procurement or more of an open enrollment model? Other questions related to this are, would there be something different about non-solar community renewable generation that we want to think about in terms of what should subscription requirements look like? And finally, are there models from other states of non-solar community renewable generation that we might want to look at? And if so, how would those be applicable to Illinois? Models from states that are vertically regulated rather than, our restructured market here is one that is certainly, we have to certainly make adjustments for that. I know that, if you go back, I think it was about 15 years ago, there was a lot of interest in community wind in Illinois that never quite caught on. But so I know that there's kernels of ideas here that have been floating around for a while. So with that, why don't we open this up for any questions or comments?
We have one comment at the moment noting that the proposed Build Back Better legislation currently in consideration in Congress includes a direct pay provision where tax incentives are paid out as upfront costs or upfront cash, which might make Community Win more viable by reducing project finance costs. And so that was from Ben Paulos.
Great, thanks, Ben. That's an interesting point. Obviously the timing of when and if that legislation passes and the development of our plan, we may have some timing issues there, but we certainly will keep that in mind.
And we have another comment from Michael Strong that if we do a competitive procurement for non-solar community generation, then the section of CJA section 175 C1G5 that requires an indexed rec might apply. So we can look into that as well. But I don't know, Anthony, if you have comments on how an indexed rec might apply to this.
That would probably be significantly more complicated because I would assume that would have an impact on the value proposition the developer would be offering to subscribers. But certainly how those provisions and the potential for non-solar community renewable generation intersect is something we can take a second look at. Or Michael, if you want to do some of the legal legwork on that, we would certainly welcome comments on what your position would be on what would be a appropriate procurement mechanism. Are there any other questions or comments?
No other questions. Oh, one just came in. That's just a general question about recording and slides. So no other questions on this topic at the moment.
Okay, great. We are actually right on schedule. So we're going to move on to the next section on utility scale and brownfield site photovoltaic procurements. And I will turn it back to Doug.
All right, thanks, Anthony. This area will be on utility scale procurements. And one thing that was mentioned earlier, that there are some aggressive goals that this act established. And the fact that we're going to move from an interim 10 million renewable energy credit goal up to 45 million renewable energy credits annually in 2030, that creates quite a challenge. And what we really want to know is, right now we do annual procurements for utility scale solar, wind, and brownfield sites. And given that we have these aggressive targets, is conducting annual procurements sufficient, or should we look at holding procurements more frequently during the year? And also, lastly, is there any particular time of the year that would be best to hold some of these procurements? So we would like the perspective on this as far as how we could do this so we have a better ability to meet these aggressive goals. Next slide. One of the procurement provisions in the new act established procuring renewable energy credits from utility scale projects located in energy transition community grant areas. In case you're not familiar with this terminology for energy transition community grants, it essentially is grants that would be available to retired fossil fuel or nuclear plants that have been decommissioned, or coal mines that have been either gone out of business or diminished in their production. So with the addition of this new provision requirement, we want to know how the most effective way to really optimize the procurement so we can get meet our goals and still enable development of these energy transition community grant areas. In the past, under the Future Jobs and Energy Act, we had a prioritization of procuring RECs from Illinois and adjacent states that was used. And there's other approaches that we've mentioned here, whether we use different eligibility requirements for the projects located in these specific areas, or maybe do a different approach on using weighting price versus other requirements. So really the whole goal is how do we optimize the procurement of all these different elements so we can meet the targets. So that's essentially the foundation for that question number 2. And then in addition, one of the other elements of the act is that the agencies shall develop an application requirement and a bid evaluation methodology for competitive requirements for bidders that may utilize a higher percentage of equity eligible contractors. And that in of itself is a new element of the act, equity eligible contractors. So essentially, how should we evaluate bids that come in for utility scale procurement, depending on the percentage of equity eligible contractors that are used on that project? So again, this is a question 3 that we want to really seek guidance on, and should we introduce a scoring preference into the bid evaluation, and what approach should we use to score that? Should it be on the basis of price, utilization, or maybe some combination of the approaches discussed in the energy transition community grant arena? On to maybe the next slide, Mega. We want to provide some feedback on procurement timelines and milestones. One of the things, again, with the aggressive targets is how do we make sure that the new utility scale projects come online and deliver the RECs that they are supposed to deliver. In the past, the procurements we did establish some firm energization and deliverable timelines. But as we've seen, particularly in the past year with the COVID pandemic, that it's sometimes extremely difficult for developers to meet some of these deadlines. So we want to seek some feedback on how the agency can balance receiving the renewable energy credits as quickly as possible to meet the targets, and at the same time balance any volumes to account for project attrition or delays the developers may have in developing the projects. And should we establish some kind of milestones or collateral requirements if projects are delayed or not quite on track for development? How do we essentially ensure that when we do these procurements that the timelines are met? And we want to really seek your feedback on some ideas or approaches to achieve these goals. Next slide. One element that's been established in the Act is the concept of subsequent forward procurements. Essentially from 240 days after the effective date of the Act, which was September 16th, the IPA has to have a procurement sufficient enough to meet 10 million recs for the target year with utility scale. And to give you a little background, some of the requirements overall for the targets is 45% should come from wind and 55% from solar for that annual delivery for recs. And for the solar requirement, that can be broken down further in that 50% comes from the adjustable block program, 47% from utility scale, and 3% from brownfield site solar projects. So given that, if we get right down to question 5, since 55% of the solar includes that from the adjustable block program, the subsequent forward procurement will not procure RECs from that program. So how should the IPA establish the quantities or targets for the utility scale and brownfield sites in this subsequent forward procurement? Keep in mind that this procurement will take place prior to the process that Anthony outlined in the beginning for the long-term plan to get that approved. So this will take place well before the long-term plan gets finalized. So we're seeking input on this subsequent forward procurement. And then to skip down to the next section, there's an additional requirement of the subsequent forward procurement. And essentially, it says that for purposes of calculating whether the agency has procured enough new wind and solar credits, renewable energy facilities out of a multi-year contract to deliver RECs with the utility through at least delivery year 2030 shall be considered new, with the exception that no renewable energy credits from contracts entered before June 1, 2021 shall be used to calculate whether the agency has procured the correct proportion of new wind and new solar contracts described for the delivery year. So that in of itself creates a little bit of a complication in how we establish what's new wind and new solar. So really it comes down in question 6, we're seeking some feedback or some guidance on essentially how to interpret this. Do we look at a complete reset of the competitive procurement targets and attempt to procure the full 10 million renewable energy credit target? Or do we look at a new ratio between the new and old, or what is that correct proportion that's identified in the act? How should we view that and determining the targets for the subsequent procurement? All right, I think next Brian will discuss.
Why don't we stop here for questions on this topic before we go to the brownfield site alternative procurement approaches, since that's a little bit distinct in nature.
Okay.
Yeah, we have several questions on this. So first, from Matthew Beach, what is the specific energy market index that the REC prices will be floating to?
It will be a Northern Illinois hub or MISO hub.
Okay, great.
And there'll be some further feedback questions on that.
And Amy, Kurt would like to know if there's a map of the energy transition community areas available.
I'm not sure, Brian, do you know if that?
I don't know. And I don't know if Anthony does, but it is the sort of thing that I think would be useful for us to, at minimum, link in our plan if that's something that's available. It wouldn't be something that we would have offhand, but it's possible that we can try to look into that and figure out how we can best provide some transparency around it.
Yeah, this is Anthony, when I was rereading those provisions of the act recently, one thing that struck me is it talks about the concept of areas where there was a nuclear plant that had been decommissioned, or a coal mine that had closed, or a coal plant that had closed. But there's no guidance in that act on how to define areas. So how far away from one of those facilities would be considered. Now, those are grants being administered by, I believe, the Department of Commerce and Economic Opportunity. So we could coordinate with them in terms of what their understanding would be of grant guidelines for eligibility.
Okay. And Nicole Lucky wants to know if the IPA includes previously procured RECs in the definition of new projects for purposes of the 2021 procurement year requirement here, how many RECs would still need to be procured to meet the 10 million requirement?
That's a good question. I'm not sure offhand what that quantity is that was procured prior to June 1st, 2021.
I want to say it's in the range of about 7 million delivered annually. Is that right, Anthony? There was some project attrition on utility scale projects, about a quarter of those projects.
I believe that's correct. What I'm trying to remember, and I had put some numbers together this at some point, and they're just drawing a blank on that, is how you would factor in the contracts from 2010, and if that number includes those. And I think those would not be considered new. I don't. Yeah, I believe it. Yes, that's why I want to be slightly cautious. I think that number is this roughly 7 million is
maybe a little less, because I remember seeing a table recently. It's about 2.5 million of wind, 2.5 million of solar for utility scale projects, plus then about 1.1 million, I think, from the adjustable block program.
Yeah, in the second revised plan that we withdrew, we do have a table of what the procurement volumes were that took into account attrition. So if we go on to the next question, I can pull that up quickly.
Sure. Milena Hessel asks on question 6 whether we've looked at forecasted budgets under the complete reset scenario, and if so, what those look like.
Good question. We haven't gotten that far in the whole process of looking at the budgets in this light. It was just a concept that we wanted to get feedback on.
Yeah, we just recently received some detailed data and updated load forecasts from the utilities, and I'm in the process of working through all of those numbers. One of the challenges here, of course, is that we obviously not only can we not predict, well, there's several layers. We can't predict the prices that will be bid in future procurements. The move to an indexed REC price model means even once we know bid prices in future procurements, the actual amounts that we paid out under contracts for utility scale projects will vary as a result. And then also we are still in the process of looking at and considering, and we'll be talking about this a little bit later this morning, the renewable energy credit prices for the adjustable block program. And so depending on where those settle, that also will have a budget impact. So it sounds like a simple question, but it's one that very quickly gets very complicated because there's a lot of moving pieces in it, and we're in the process of pulling those together still. But fundamentally, I mean, the changes to allow for the amount collected each year to increase, and then more flexibility for how money gets spent over time that was contained in CETA gives us a lot more flexibility than we previously had under the previous RPS regime.
Okay. Nancy LaPlaca asks a clarification question for the question 5 on the screen, asking if you're saying that the 55% of the RECs from the ABP will only apply to 2021 and that forward years will not include RECs from ABP?
I think the 55% refers to 55% of solar relative to wind, which is 45%. And that includes adjustable block program recs. So I'm not sure the timing issue, how it kind of plays in here. The point is that you have, within solar, unlike with wind, you have both recs from the adjustable block program and from utility scale procurements. Alternatively, with wind, it's just utility scale projects.
Okay.
Yeah, because go ahead.
Oh, I was just going to move on to the next question unless you have anything else on that.
Nope.
Okay. And then finally, last question for this section, John Delury asks, is there a feasible route to include bid price handicaps to competitive bids for both desired criteria? Factor in prioritization for energy transition community grant community siting and EECs without having to do multiple procurement stages. He says, I think this is what is hinted at via the weight price option, e.g. $5 per rec handicap for location, $5 for EEC involvement over a certain threshold, etc.
That certainly could be one model. I mean, if I understand it correctly, it would be in the sense that since a competitive procurement, you take the low price bids, that a higher price bid would basically have a discount discount applied to it for the purpose of bid evaluation to account for various criteria that are met. That certainly could be one approach. I mean, I think one challenge of that is with that, since we're moving into a new regime and we do not have much price discovery yet, what the appropriate amount of weighting, I think could be very challenging, because I think we could potentially see some very large spreads in bid prices, and the handicap may or may not achieve the goals that are desired. So I think that's to me, I mean, it's certainly one of the approaches we could take, but to me, that would be one of the challenges of that approach, which is why we're really interested in feedback on different types of approaches. If there could be a way to sort of flesh out that approach and maybe account for the issues I raised, or other potential complications, models from other states that have worked, et cetera. That's all the sort of feedback that we would really appreciate in comments.
Okay, those are the only questions for this section right now.
All right, Brian, I think you have the next.
I actually think we had one more slide. Maybe we should. We're beginning to run a little behind schedule, so maybe we could cover. Yeah, we have one slide about index direct prices that we could maybe quickly raise and move on to brownfield issues.
Sure. This concept was mentioned earlier, but essentially the Act established a requirement that utility scale procurements would implement indexed rec pricing. And the Act defines that the settlement period for the index pricing is based on either the MISO or PJM market, specifically the real-time energy market. And both of the PJM and MISO markets utilize a 5-minute real-time settlement for energy. Essentially, we wanted to know if this 5-minute period is practical to index the rec prices, or should we consider a different settlement period, such as hourly or monthly? What settlement period should be used in determining the indexed rec prices? And then, in addition to having an indexed rec pricing for the procurements, the Act also established the ability to institute a price collar for which the recs would be paid. And this essentially is establishing a floor and a ceiling for that index. And the IPA is really looking for guidance in what kind of price collars are used in the marketplace now. What should we establish? Because essentially the goal is to have some predictability of the rec prices and ensure what we're spending on those rec prices, on those recs. So we're really looking for feedback on that price collar? What should be the floor and the ceiling? Is it a percentage or a price difference? What would be some alternatives that we might want to look at? And maybe I'll pause and see if there's any questions on this before we move on.
One quick point I just want to add on this is that the price collar will not apply to the subsequent forward procurements that are taking place in the spring of 2022, that, as Doug previously mentioned, are implemented prior to the development and approval of the next long-term plan. This is something that will be included in the long-term plan for procurements that take place subsequent to the plan's approval.
Right. So the procurement we do this spring will just have an index, but not a collar associated with the price.
We don't have any questions or comments on this right now.
Okay, great. Let's move on to the next section. Brian will be discussing brownfield site procurements.
Sure. This is Brian Granahan, Chief Legal Counsel at the IPA. And just wanted to cover this quickly, and it's the sort of thing that probably lends itself to written comments. But just for a little bit of background, the Future Energy Jobs Act contained requirements specific to procurements for the development of solar at brownfield sites. So brownfield site photovoltaic projects is referred to in the law. Back after the implementation, or after our first long-term plan, we conducted 2 procurements to seek proposals for the development of solar at brownfield site projects. There are some challenges that we noted with the definition that I just want to flag here, and we can always use comments on those. One was that if sites participated in the Illinois Site Remediation Program, that often resulted in false positives because sometimes they're participating in that program for the sake of clearance from real estate transactions, but technically under the definition, they were regulated by that program. And then the regulated by standard, regulated under certain programs to qualify as a brownfield site, wasn't totally clear from the law what that meant, because there are 4 programs referenced in the definition, 2 US EPA programs and 2 Illinois EPA programs, and each of them has a different arc of regulatory activities. So that created some challenges where we had to kind of work through what the right standard was, so that if we knew something was effectively a brownfield site and it had been regulated at some point under one of those programs, that we weren't disqualifying it because there wasn't some sort of active ongoing oversight at that site. Eventually we got through those. We had a first procurement where we had no successful bids, and then a second procurement where we had 2 successful bids. We were able to meet what at that point were the 2020 brownfield site photovoltaic project rec procurement targets under the law. And now we're entering an environment where obviously budgets have expanded and goals have expanded. Brownfield site photovoltaic procurements constitute 3% of the overall solar share, but it's 50% from utility scale projects, 47% from utilities, and 50% from ABP, 47% from utility scale, and 3% from brownfield site projects. One of the things that the law introduces is this idea that we can use alternative procurement approaches for procuring RECs from brownfield site projects. Previously, we had used the traditional price-based competitive procurement that we use for both our energy procurements or capacity procurements, and then also for utility scale REC procurements to procure RECs from brownfield site projects. So brownfield site projects submit a proposal. The proposal qualifies as part of the Part 1 process by meeting certain thresholds, and then bids are evaluated on the basis of price thereafter. We are proposing, as it stands now, to continue to do this until we at least have the chance to evaluate what this looks like given some of the other changes applicable to competitive procurements, and specifically the ability to use an index rec price approach, which would hopefully help address some of the risks associated with the cost recovery for these projects. And then we would utilize the results from those procurements using the traditional price-based competitive approach, but adjusted through the movement toward an index rec price approach, and see if we're successful with that approach. And then as part of our next long-term plan, start to evaluate whether alternative procurement structures or processes make sense. Nevertheless, the law does authorize us to move away from a competitive procurement approach. So we are curious whether other models might make sense, and we're seeking stakeholder feedback on that topic. So as we go to the next slide. So the questions that we put out are what other approaches, if any, should the IPA consider proposing as part of the plan development to support a brownfield site photovoltaic projects? And in terms of other approaches, what comes to mind is, well, maybe this means an administratively determined REC price, similar to what we do for the adjustable block program or the Illinois Solar for All program. And then the question is, should we wait? Should we wait to see, as we're proposing to do, or we're thinking of doing at least, should we wait to see what comes out of these procurement events before we change course and utilize something like an administratively set price? And then, there's the question of what barriers would a different procurement approach be best suited to solving. So if we're moving toward an administratively set price, or maybe we have some sort of more qualitative scoring system where we're taking into account other attributes of the project, what barriers are we addressing through that process, or what barriers have been observed with brownfield site photovoltaic procurements that we can solve through a different approach? Another question is, to what extent, if any, do changes to the competitive procurement pricing structure found in the Act address prior barriers observed in brownfield site photovoltaic procurements? In other words, does the movement toward an indexed REC pricing model and the ability to have a floating REC price based on energy market revenues address some of the barriers that we observed previously in conducting brownfield site photovoltaic procurements? That's something we'd love to get a feel for in stakeholder feedback. I believe there may be other questions. I could be wrong about that.
I believe there's one more slide on this topic.
And then the two additional questions here, in thinking through approaches other than a price-based competitive procurement, what else might we consider valuing in determining what brownfield site photovoltaic projects should be chosen? And we list just a set of ideas that came to mind, whether it's environmental justice, community status, remediation commitments, population density of the project surrounding area, which is something that's come up in the community-driven community solar context, equitable workforce hiring commitments. So there's a host of other qualitative objectives that we might be able to take into account through a different process for choosing bids than just a price-based structure. And if we were to move toward that sort of a process, I guess the question is, what of these seems most worthy, best matches with the law, or might solve barriers to what's intended to be achieved more broadly through the development of brownfield site photovoltaic projects? And then the last question concerns some of the new diversity and equity provisions related to IPA procurements. And we'll get into this a little bit later in discussing the new diversity and equity requirements. There are requirements for competitive procurements to develop bid application requirements and bid evaluation methodology for ensuring that equity eligible contractors, their use is optimized on projects, and that winning or successful applicants will partner for EECs and giving preference to bids for those that do. There's a little bit of mixed language here about whether this applies to brownfield site photovoltaic procurements, to all competitive procurements, to just utility scale procurements. So we'd love to get some feedback on that, likely through the written comment process. And then the remainder of this question just kind of gets into how there's this tension here where in some cases utility scale projects are referenced, in other cases competitive procurements are referenced, which we believe would then necessarily include brownfield site photovoltaic projects. And then, as we'll get into later today, how do we go about making changes to the bid selection process in light of these requirements? Traditionally, for competitive procurements, you have this part 1 and part 2 process. Part 1 is qualification. You've met a certain standard in order to be able to participate in the procurement, and we can certainly incorporate these types of objectives into that standard. And then part 2 is the evaluation of bids for those that have met the part 1 standard. And traditionally that's happened on the basis of price, but again, there could be adjustments to the part 2 process as well, where we're taking other elements into account as far as price goes. So there's the question of whether this applies to brownfield site photovoltaic project procurements, and then how it should be applied. And those are the sorts of questions that we have on the new brownfield site photovoltaic procurement requirements. And with that, if there's any questions, we'd be happy to take them here.
I'm not seeing any questions or comments at the moment.
And we understand this is the sort of thing that might lend itself to written comments, perhaps better than a discussion that might take place here. But we're very interested in proposals and thoughts, especially for those that have worked in the brownfield site photovoltaic project development space or seeking to develop projects themselves. It's not something that we have perfect visibility into. What those barriers look like aren't the sort of thing that always falls within the field of vision of the IPA. So any feedback would be helpful on this, just to help us get an understanding of this space.
Yeah, I would add to that. I mean, as Brian mentioned, we had a previous set of procurements. We did ultimately have procurement that had 2 selected projects. So we have a little bit of data on what can work here, but that's a very small data set compared to, if you look more nationally, the amount of solar on brownfield sites. So I think experience that goes broader than our experience would be really helpful here. With that, I believe, Brian, the next section of the workshop is also one that you'll be leading.
Sure. This is about a new provision found in the IPA Act as modified through the Climate Equitable Jobs Act. I think it's section 1-75 C1R that creates a large customer self-direct RPS compliance program. So we have some stakeholder feedback questions that we put out on this program specifically. This is not a huge amount of text in the Act. I think it's about 6 or 7 pages. So it's the sort of thing that we can pretty easily reference, but then trying to understand it, I think it calls to mind some different interpretive issues, some of which we flagged here. Just to give a basic overview of what we understand this section as trying to accomplish. Basically, for projects that are being developed, utility scale wind and utility scale solar projects that are being developed outside of IPA procurement processes, where those RECs are not being sold to Illinois electric utilities through the IPA's procurements, you may have a corporate buyer who then is entering into a PPA or maybe just a REC delivery agreement with that project. And by virtue of participating in this self-direct program, they would have the ability to then receive a rebate or a credit, as I believe the law calls it, on their utility bills through a reduced charge applicable to collections from the RPS. And the IPA is responsible for setting that charge. We understand that charge to be set basically based on procurement events that the IPA conducts after that customer's participation for utility scale projects. So essentially, we're backing out from what's being charged to those customers the utility scale costs of the IPA's procurement events for those that are conducted after such time as that customer successfully participates. So in broad strokes, that's what we understand this to be here. This is a program that we ultimately proposed through our long-term plan and established the size for based on publicly available analyses and studies. And the customers do have to be large customers, as we'll get into a little bit. So there's a few different elements associated with this that we'd love feedback on. The first is customer eligibility. One of the things that's allowed for here is the aggregation of multiple retail customer accounts under the same corporate parent to meet this 10,000 kilowatt peak demand threshold, where a customer is sufficiently large to be able to then participate in the self-direct program. So the most obvious example of how this would mean, or how this would play out is, for instance, you might have a retail chain, a chain of retail stores that all have the same corporate affiliation. Any one of those individual stores would not have sufficient peak demand to meet the threshold, but all of them taken together may be able to surpass that 10,000 kilowatt peak demand threshold. And as a consequence, if they have the requisite agreement, long-term agreement to procure RECs from a new utility scale wind or solar project that meets the geographic requirements of the law, then they could qualify for the program. So as we look to the market, we have a question of how should we determine whether multiple retail customer accounts indeed connect back to the same corporate parent? What documents would constitute appropriate proof of that affiliation and allow that affiliation to be understood as connecting back to the customer's utility account? Essentially, how do we define whether or not this particular aggregation threshold of the law is met? What evidence works for us and what standards should be applied? And then for multiple aggregated accounts, should the 10,000 kilowatt threshold be based on coincident or non-coincident total highest demand peak demands? So it's a matter of calculation at that point, how we essentially add up the peak demand of each of these customers and determine whether or not the 10,000 kilowatt peak demand threshold has been passed. So I don't know if we have feedback on this question specifically. It is fairly specific in nature, but this is something that we would love feedback on through our stakeholder feedback process as we figure out how to apply this new large customer RPS self-direct program. So move to the next slide. So customer eligibility is one thing. So it's that customer who's essentially benefiting from this program by virtue of being able to then receive a credit on their bill where their charges for RPS collections is reduced. Project eligibility is another, and it's basically looking at that customer's relationship with a given new renewable energy project to see if that project qualifies under section 1-75C1R. C1R2 requires that RECs be sourced from new utility scale wind projects or new utility scale solar projects, but new is not actually defined within C1R. New is defined separately within section 1-75C1. I forget the exact provision, but it connects back to that new constitutes a project that was energized on or after June 1st, 2017. That's found elsewhere within the governing RPS statute. So we were thinking that that would be the definition that would also apply in subparagraph R. And then geographic eligibility of those projects, if you look back at our prior long-term plans, whether adjacent state utility scale projects can be considered was something that was addressed through chapter 4 of those plans, where we were applying the language in section 1-75C1I of the IPA Act and basically saying, okay, does this adjacent state project, wherever it's located, does that provide enough public benefit back to Illinois residents such that the project's REC should be eligible for the Illinois RPS? So we would then apply that same standard to the geographic location of these projects. That would be the projects that the customer would have a relationship with in order to benefit from the self-direct program. So the first question we have is just, is this the right approach to what constitutes a new project? Another way of looking at it is new for purposes of this provision of the law that didn't exist prior to the Climate and Equitable Jobs Act should be new as of the date that the law took effect. So a project that was energized, let's say after September 15th, 2021. We're not sure if that would be consistent with or inconsistent with the intent behind this section, but it is something to consider because new, effectively new is new as of the date of that law in some sense. That the project, if it existed previously, was not new at the time the law was enacted. And then for geographic qualification, there are new provisions under section 1-75C1I that allows for electricity projects that produce electricity transmitted to Illinois-based high voltage GC converter stations. They can now qualify for their RECs being able to be sold under the Illinois RPS. So right now, in our current approach, we have the ability to qualify certain adjacent state projects where we apply a scoring system, and you can basically draw concentric circles out from Illinois to determine where projects qualify. Now, under modifications to section 1-75C1I, found in that section under the Climate and Equitable Jobs Act, you could have a utility scale project that exists outside of those concentric circles. And if their electricity is transmitted to an Illinois-based HVDC converter station that meets other requirements in the law, then that underlying project's REC would then qualify for the Illinois RPS. The question then becomes, does it also qualify for the self-direct standard? Does that project, if they have a PPA, let's say, with Illinois-based customers, would that still qualify for the self-direct program in the same way that the project might be able to qualify for, say, a utility scale procurement? So that's a question that we're putting out to the world about the self-direct program as well. Let's go on to the next slide. Program size is something that we would love feedback on. It's the law talks about us relying on publicly available analyses and studies of the potential market size for utility scale renewable energy long-term purchase agreements by commercial industrial energy customers. So, and then that is basically used to help us determine what the size of this program should be. And we're in the process right now of working with our procurement planning consultant to try to pull together some different analyses and studies, but we would love feedback in stakeholder comments about where we can best find this information. One of the challenges is that you have this aggregation provision. So we can't just look at, say, customer accounts, where we might say, all right, what are all of the metered accounts that surpass 10,000 kilowatts in size? And then we know the overall size of customers who are large enough to be able to participate in the program. Doesn't quite work that way because of corporate affiliation. And there's kind of another step that has to be taken into account there, where you can have a number of smaller customers that would still be able to participate here due to the ability to aggregate their accounts if they have that corporate affiliation. So we've put a few questions out on this as well to help us try to determine how we can right size the self-direct program. First, what publicly available analyses and studies are available to us? We'd love to be able to establish a proposed size of the program through our draft plan. Maybe it's the sort of thing where this is under review across December and January, and we're putting together a range in our draft plan and then getting more feedback through the stakeholder feedback process for our draft plan. We'll have to see what we can get done by that time, but any information about good publicly available analyses and studies, I think we'd love to get through stakeholder feedback. And then there's provisions in the law to talk about us making a determination about program size annually. So by when each year should we be making this determination, and what should that process look like, especially given that our long-term plan development process takes place biannually. So maybe on every other year, we can establish program size through our long-term plan, but then that raises the question of what do we do in those years where we don't have a plan that we're developing and filing with the ICC. Should we publish the initial delivery year self-direct program size as part of our upcoming long-term plan? We understand, given the timing of this, where this program effectively begins in some sense on June 1st, 2023, that we kind of need to, because our long-term plan would be approved by the ICC by about July of 2022. So in order to have a project application or a program application process stood up and visibility that participants have into the actual size of the program, we probably do need to do that, but we'd love feedback if there's some sort of other approach that we should take here. And then again, given that customer account size does not account for permitted account aggregation by corporate affiliates, we can't just look and say, how many customers meet a 10,000 kilowatt peak demand threshold? Because it could be multiple customers that ultimately qualify if they have corporate affiliation. So how do we best assess the size of the retail customer market that would be eligible for self-direct RPS compliance? And then once we know that size of the market, what is the overall amount of customers that can participate? What does that look like in terms of 40% of their load being met through RECs, which is one of the requirements of C1R? We can then determine how best to size our program in order to meet that customer base. So I think here, before getting on to the next slide, I don't know if we have any questions, Sarah, but I'll pause to see if we have any questions about these provisions so far.
No questions so far.
And we completely understand here, especially because it's a little bit of a niche topic. For instance, participants in the adjustable block program or others wouldn't really be affected by this new self-direct program. There could be some impact on the overall RPS budget, but not in a wholly significant way. So we understand that it's maybe a narrow universe of entities that are looking at this and thinking about how to apply these provisions. So go on to the next slide. So again, on program size, one of the other provisions here is that Section 1-75C1 R3 provides for ensuring that participation is evenly split between commercial and industrial users in the case of more applicants than the program size could accommodate. And that's useful guidance. So if we have more applicants than we have space available under the program, we're working toward an even split between commercial and industrial users. That doesn't solve the whole program, the whole problem though. What happens if we have more applicants within one of those categories? In other words, how do we choose between competing commercial industrial users within that individual category? I think there's probably a lot of community solar project developers that are scarred from the lottery process and the use of a random selection process to determine who gets a benefit. Here, maybe the stakes are a little bit lower because there's the ability to participate the next program year potentially. But nevertheless, we're faced with a situation where we could have more applicants than we have space available within one of those categories, and we have to figure out who to choose. Maybe that's based on the application date. Maybe that's based on another random selection process. Maybe that's based on the size of the application. Maybe that's based on some sort of qualitative standards. But through this feedback process, we would love feedback to say, how exactly do we choose between competing individual commercial or industrial users within that category? Should we have more applications than the program has capacity? And then relatedly, should we maintain a wait list for qualified applicants where the next year, when we reopen the program for additional applications, waitlisted applicants are given preference, those that were found to be qualified, but just we didn't simply have the space for in that year. So that's something that we're seeking stakeholder feedback on as well. So go to the next slide. So bill crediting here is a bit complicated, and I think it probably takes some time to it takes a few readings of the relevant provisions to understand exactly what that benefit is back to the customer who participates. The law talks about that the amount credited back to the customer shall be equivalent to the anticipated cost of REC deliveries under contracts for new utility scale wind and utility scale solar entered into for each delivery year after the large energy customer begins retiring eligible new utility scale renewable energy credits for self-compliance. So in other words, if you have someone who qualifies, you have an applicant who qualifies in 2023 and they're participating in 2023, then our understanding of this is basically then for the delivery year thereafter, those utility scale procurements that we conduct and contracts that are executed, you take into account those costs when those costs are actually felt in determining the amount credited back to those customers. And in this slide, we have a bit of an outline of that approach. So credit levels are based on the upcoming delivery years, utility scale project costs based on the utility scale project contract expenses after successful enrollment. So again, one delivery year later, then you're looking at those procurements that are conducted in that next delivery year and those delivery years thereafter. And that's what's giving you the number or the expense amount that you're then using to determine the credit back to the customer. Now, the implication of this is, and this is the reading that we understand, so there's another reading available that doesn't leave us in this place, we'd love to hear it, is that if you have a customer that starts participating in the program in 2023, then you have essentially the next delivery year and those delivery years procurements thereafter that determines the credit level back to the customer. But for a customer that begins to participate in the next program year in 2024, they would have a different rate as the years that you're taking into account in determining their credit back are only for those that occur thereafter for that customer. And as a consequence, there's a year of procurements that are not taken into account for that second customer that would be for that first customer. And where that leaves us is we have a situation where we're publishing, as the years go by, rates that are based on each participation year for the credit back to those customers. So as we implement this across the years, in each year we're going to have, assuming we have successful participation in each year within this program and utility scale procurements that ultimately result in expenses, we would have different rates based on that customer's year of program application. So the 2023 customer has one rate, the 2024 customer has another rate, the 2025 customer has another rate, depending upon when that customer applied to the program. So that's a bit complicated. At the same time, that's our reading of the law. We've gone back over it a few times and we're not sure that there's another reading available. As we go to the next slide. So this is what we're seeking feedback on essentially is what's the right approach here? Is this in fact the right approach? Do commenters agree with the IPA statutory interpretation? Are there other colorable interpretations that could potentially apply here and get us out of this situation where we're talking about a different rate year over year over year over year based on that customer's participation. So not only does that customer's rate change annually, but there's just another rate class in the sense that's added on with each successive program year. The law further provides that while the agency shall ultimately determine the self-directed amounts, it should be filed with the commission as a compliance filing, but must be approved by the commission by June 1st of each year, beginning in 2023. And this is a bit of a narrow question, but we're kind of seeking some feedback on procedurally what this looks like. Normally, compliance filings are basically made in compliance with the commission order, and so they're not subject to any sort of formal process. What does the process look like here if commission approval is ultimately required? Does this mean there's some sort of comment process around the self-direct rates? Or does approval just mean that we make this filing within our long-term plan case, and if nobody does anything thereafter, it's effectively de facto approved by the commission? And then also, what information should we include in this filing to help the commission with making this determination, if in fact they're ultimately taking an active step to approve the self-direct crediting rates? And then also, how can we provide interested parties with visibility into how this is being set? So I will stop here. I know we have at least one question that came in, so go ahead and move to that question.
I'm still waiting. The current message just says has introductory text. So I'm still waiting for the full question to come in.
Melina, if you want to be unmuted, we can just do that too, because given the complexity associated with this, it might be easier to explain orally than to go through writing all this out.
Yeah, she would prefer to be unmuted, so let me do that.
Hey guys, thanks. This is Melina Hessel from the Environmental Law and Policy Center. I have what may be a dumb question, but Brian, when you were explaining the bill crediting, as I heard you talk through it, I heard you talk about like a single interpretation of the statute that you think you're going to have to apply. At the same time, in your text for this, you lay out, thus for a customer retiring recs for self-compliance in 2023, and then alternatively for a customer which begins retiring recs in 2024. So I'm confused as if you're offering these two scenarios in opposition to each other, or if you're seeing them as like the single statutory interpretation that is available to you, both of them together. Does that make sense?
Yeah, and I apologize for that. It's a single statutory interpretation, but what we're trying to do is draw a contrast between how there'll be different treatment for customers based on their application year.
Okay.
So it's just intended to provide an illustrative example of how we would apply our interpretation to customers who apply one in 2023, one in 2024.
So the whole second half of that paragraph is one illustrative example. It is not one and an alternative.
No, but if you can come up with an alternative, we're certainly interested in hearing it.
I understand. Okay.
Yeah, it comes through. No, and I apologize. I think it probably gets a bit repetitive, but because the concept may be difficult to grasp, I think we wanted to walk through this from a few different angles and trying to explain it and say, okay, how does this work in application? And as we're thinking about putting the long-term plan together, we've been developing outlines in our end. We're going to have a whole example of how bill crediting would work. So that would add a little bit more color around all of this, where we're describing it in a little bit more detail and kind of giving an example with potential actual numbers involved. And I think that will make everything much more helpful. For the sake of brevity, in some of these stakeholder comment processes, we don't go to that level of detail, but certainly for the draft long-term plan, we will.
Okay, there aren't any other questions at this time.
Okay, we had a break scheduled for 10:40, so we're about 10 minutes ahead of schedule. Why don't we take a 5-minute break now, or maybe a few more minutes than 5, and let's reconvene at 10:35, and we have 2 more topics to go through this morning, and then we'll take a lunch break and go on to our afternoon session. So let's take a quick break. Everyone can stretch their legs, get another cup of coffee, etc., and then we will move on to a discussion of high-level diversity, equity, inclusion issues starting at 10:35. Good morning, everyone. This is Anthony Starr from the Illinois Power Agency again. We're ready to get started again after our break, and I'd like to apologize. I misread my slide numbers, and we actually have 2 more slides left on the topic of the utility of the large customer self-direct program. So Brian is going to finish up on this topic, and then we will move on to our discussion of diversity, equity, and inclusion. Brian?
Sure, and we'll do this pretty quickly because ultimately this is, again, it's a more narrow topic and we have broader topics coming up, but the two slides on the application process. These are all taken from questions that you saw in stakeholder feedback, so we can just get feedback through the written process, assuming there are no questions. But essentially, how should the application process operate? Ultimately, we're getting an application from a customer. We're making a determination about whether that customer, in fact, meets that 10,000 kilowatt threshold. And then we also have to look at the contract and look at the underlying facility and see if those qualify under the law as well. So what are the mechanics of that application process look like? Should we be doing this all contemporaneously? How long should the application window last? By when are we opening up this program for applications? So we'd love feedback on the mechanics of this process on these points. Then on the next slide. And then there's also discussion of proof and supporting documentation. And in other words, we're not just relying on attestations for determining whether the customer meets the qualifications associated with participating in the program, which is mostly size-based, or whether the project or underlying contract with that facility meets those requirements as well. So we'd love feedback on how we actually determine whether this is an application that meets both the customer requirements and the project and contract requirements. What types of documentation should we seek? It may just be that underlying contract with the facility in all cases is the proof that's dispositive here, but we'd love feedback if there's something else or if there are challenges associated with receiving that type of proof. There's also requirements around the application of prevailing wage and equity standards. And how do we ensure compliance with those standards when we're not participating in the procurement in the same way, and we don't have those contracting rights, or we don't have the same basic instrument rights that we'll have in other contexts. So any feedback on how we determine compliance there is helpful. And then confidentiality considerations. We understand that to apply to the program, there's a lot of financial information that's being demonstrated and account information. And we'd love to hear back from anyone about what confidentiality considerations apply to the information we receive from applicants to the self-direct program. So if we have any questions on those items, love to hear them. If not, we can move on to the next topic area.
No questions, so feel free to move on.
Okay, great. So our next topic area is diversity, equity, and inclusion. We have a number of slides here that talk about some overarching themes that are included in the new provisions that apply to the Illinois Power Agency that come out of CEJA. Certain aspects that relate to this we will get into in more detail this afternoon as we talk about the adjustable block program and the Illinois Solar for All program. So this is a first cut at some big issues that we want to go over and get some feedback on how to think about this. This is a whole set of issues that are very important to the agency, but quite frankly is a new way for us to organize and work and think about what we do as an agency to promote the clean energy economy of the state. So I think these are obviously some of the most important goals of CEJA, is to make sure that there is there are equity provisions that run throughout the work we do. But for us, this will be a major shift for our organization in terms of implementing it. So we really kind of throw our arms open and really appreciate whatever stakeholder feedback we can receive to help us learn as an agency how to best implement these provisions. And with that, I will turn it over to Sharon Johnson, who is our newly hired Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Manager. She is on, this is week 3 of her time at the agency. So I welcome Sharon, and I'll let you take the next slide.
Thank you very much, Anthony. Can you hear me okay?
Loud and clear.
Perfect. Good morning, everyone. My name is Sharon Johnson, and I am the Diversity, Equity, Inclusion Manager for IPA. Today, I'm going to touch briefly on a few items from CEJA, as Anthony mentioned, for diversity, equity, and inclusion. And I'll be reviewing engaging participation plans for the equity accountability system, what that should look like, compliance reporting, training and guidance. And then towards the end of this portion of the presentation, I'll hand it over to Brian to finish out on competitive procurement issues. And Anthony will close us out on the waiver system and the racial disparity and discrimination study. So with that, the first item we want to address today is encouraging participation from diverse populations. And we'd like to see about input and thoughts around this topic while working with minority-focused business groups and diverse populations and equitable workforces. We want to take a look at the time we take to identify strong opportunities for local outreach and strong encouragement in the program. So we like to get input on what this may look like, from conducting meetings to providing information to potential entities to discuss a few of the barriers, good faith efforts, as well as any incentives for motivation to respond to bids. Next slide. Okay, here we have the equity accountability system, and there's loads to unpack in this particular slide. So for the sake of time, I just want to touch on a few major points. What would stakeholders like to see insofar as the equity accountability system and what this would look like? So this is going to be basically an equitable set of policies and procedures to have metrics in place to hold entities accountable for performance. That's the 50,000-foot view of an accountability system. And so we'd like to review possibly some challenges to potential issues associated with the project workforces, incremental increases over a period of time, and also equitable provisions that are defined for the workforce, construction trainees, and also if other disciplines should be included, such as sales and marketing. So we just want to think about that for a moment and see how we can get our arms around what's going to be included in this system and what some of the KPI or key performance indicators will be. Next slide. Okay, here we'd like to talk about another aspect of the law for compiling compliance reports for equitable accountability. And what I'd like to see us think about is, here we want to start considering some of the major KPIs or key performance indicators impacting benchmarking for project progress. So this is going to be developing metrics across approved vendor participants insofar as the adjusted block program metrics categories concerned. We're not sure if that's going to look differently. So that's another aspect we'd like to consider. Next slide. Finally, training, guidance, and support. Here we want to begin to just, in addition to the approaches for training and support, think about some of the wraparound services to enhance the experience of workers to ensure success. Resources provided by some of the entities to address some of the issues that some of the participants would have, start thinking about that, such as transportation services, childcare, and possibly adjusted start hours. Next slide. Here, I'm going to stop and introduce IPA's chief legal. Sorry.
Should we stop for a moment, since there's a bit of a shift in topics here? Maybe stop here and see if there are any questions on the initial set of slides.
Yes, we have one question that's actually more of a request for additional questions from IPA. Milena Hessel is just noting that the questions so far on DEI are rather technical, related to metrics and specific elements of the law. She's wondering if, given there are many non-technical stakeholders that might be interested in providing feedback on these topics, whether there are higher level questions that we could provide that we'd like to hear back on.
Sure. I think one of the reasons that these questions are pretty technical is that the provisions of CJA around the equity accountability system are pretty specific in terms of what needs to be included. And so what we were trying to focus in on is where we saw things that would benefit from some fleshing out of what those specific criteria mean. Stepping back, I think the high level, I don't know if it's a question or sort of thought, is that what the goal here is to create, as Sharon described, these equity accountability system to ensure that over time the clean energy workforce of Illinois does develop, and again we're given certain guidelines in it. So one of the things that we were looking at is that this is going to be an overall shift in terms of the work we do that's going to touch anyone who is participating in any of our programs and procurements. Brian will talk in a moment about specifically around competitive procurements, but this also will flow through to the adjustable block program as well. So maybe the high level question would be feedback in terms of, as people look at some of the things that we've highlighted here, what are the opportunities and challenges people see in terms of the industry adopting to the guidelines we've been given by the General Assembly to ensure that there's a diverse and equitable renewable energy industry in the state. So I don't know if that's pretty high level. Brian, do you want to add something to that?
I was going to say, is it possible to, Milena, would you want to be unmuted? Just trying to get a sense for the types of questions that might be you're thinking of addressing in comments, I would think, and whether it would be helpful to us.
Brian, I am not myself a diversity, equity, inclusion expert. I've been talking to community groups and EJ groups, and I know they care a lot about seeing these provisions work, and would like to be able to provide comment, but feel lost, I think, in trying to get through the complexity, which I understand, and I'm sure I and others will work to try to help bridge that. But I guess what I'm thinking is, the place that comes from is thinking that, like, it would be helpful for you to get technical feedback when people have specific proposals, but are there other if there are, maybe there are probably different options that you have in mind for some of these things too. So if higher level feedback on what people would view as successful would be helpful in informing the options you receive back, maybe something like that. I'm not sure that there's something that would be helpful to you, Brian. That was the question. Are there higher levels that would actually level questions that would actually be helpful to you as you're considering options or sifting through the options that are submitted in.
If we could go back to slide 32 for a moment, I think this might sort of get at what I think one piece of what Milena is getting at. So, so we have this provision, obviously, to encourage participating projects to use diverse and equitable workforce and diverse set of contractors. So there's, one aspect of how we developed, for example, the adjustable block program is that it very much is sort of, an open enrollment program where, vendors sign up to participate and they come in and submit applications. To date, in that program, the agency has not done outreach. There's been enough demand from the industry coming to the program that we've obviously filled up the initial blocks for it. So I think one of the questions, and maybe this is getting at that sort of high level things, is as an agency, we do not have the experience doing proactive outreach to businesses and organizations to find parts of the workforce or contractors out there who might be able to participate either as prime contractors, approved vendors, or subcontractors. So, I mean, one thing that would be very helpful to groups, to us, would be to have information from groups that have experience on these sorts of issues, on what has worked in either in other states taking this on or in other industry sectors, on how, as a state agency, do we pivot to this sort of idea that we would want to be more proactive in the sort of outreach we do to bring people and businesses into our programs.
Yeah, one thing I would say there is, and it just piggybacking off what Anthony said, I think, Milena, my thought is our questions tend to be deep, but that doesn't mean there's not value in feedback that goes wide. It's just that our questions tend to be deep because that's sort of the space that we know. We dig into the law, we're familiar with this issue space. But just by way of example, when the bill was being developed, we'd hear narratives around, for instance, challenges with the cannabis process, but that's not really within our field of expertise. And so we know the broad narrative associated with it, but we may not know the specifics of where things got tripped up or where objectives that were sought were ultimately not achieved. So if there are corollary examples of efforts to try to achieve some of the same diversity and equity objectives in non-energy issue spaces, that's something that we would love to get in feedback, but we wouldn't have ready access to in the same way. Sharon would have some expertise there, but the agency itself doesn't really have institutional knowledge around in any way. So I think that would be really valuable.
We have one more question, which is a bit of a clarification question, and I think Brian and Anthony, you both kind of referred to this, but just clarifying that this section is not including specific diversity and equity programs for the adjustable block program, and whether the ABP also includes separate equity requirements, which we'll get to later.
This will encompass ABP over time. There's a specific category now in the adjustable block program for projects from equity eligible contractors, but then there is also a goal contained within this system that over time the workforce across all of our programs and procurements becomes more diverse.
Okay, and one more question. So equity eligible contractors and equity eligible persons definition doesn't include the minority women MWBEs. I'm saying that's minority women business entities, trade unions, grads of workforce training programs in general. So how will the IPA square this broad stated goal of the law with the narrow specific requirements of the definition?
I think this is where the equity accountability system begins to create some of those opportunities. That is correct that the definition of equity eligible contractor and equity eligible persons has a very prescribed definition in the law, having to do with a certain set of criteria that do not correlate to ones that were included in the question, or correlate only to a certain extent. But this is where I think things like opportunities for more proactive outreach are a place where the agency would have the opportunity to think more broadly and think about how we look at a more diverse set of participants in the industry. We'll be getting to in a little bit the a study that the agency is required to do after programs have been operating for a year that I think also will get at this issue, that we do have an opportunity coming up to focus on whether or not we're achieving those sort of broad goals of the law.
Okay, no other questions on this at this time.
Okay, great. Let's move on to the next slide, which I believe is about competitive procurements. Brian?
Sure, and we touched on this a little bit in talking through the Brownfield site procurement process, and I think John Delury had some really good comments on that are probably pretty applicable here too. So section 1-75C10(3) requires the IPA to develop requirements for ensuring that the competitive procurement processes, including utility scale solar, utility scale wind, and brownfield site photovoltaic projects, advance the equity goals of the subsection, and to develop bid application requirements, which is something we're familiar with and more familiar with doing, the application requirements having a certain threshold, and a bid evaluation methodology, which is a little bit different than what we've done previously for competitive procurements generally, for ensuring that utilization of equity eligible contractors. So this kind of gets into what should we do to operationalize this language? The objectives seem to be pretty clear, but how we get there most effectively is what we really want feedback on. So what types of criteria might such a methodology include? In other words, let's say that we're engaged in a bit of a evaluation methodology where for our competitive procurements, we're moving past just simply scoring on the basis of a proposed price and taking the lowest price bids for those that qualify. What does it look like to score bids differently? How much weight do we offer to price? What else are we balancing that against? And how best can we balance that? And that could be thought of a number of different ways. It could be thought of in terms of the percentage of a bid pegged to some sort of baseline. It could be thought of as a certain dollar amount associated with achieving thresholds. So there's just different ways to look at this, and we'd love some feedback from the stakeholder comment process about how best to do so. Alternatively, would this just require that winning bidders use at least a certain amount or percentage of equity eligible contractors to comply with this section? So if you meet a threshold, you can participate, but you have to meet that threshold in order to be able to participate. And then we're not even getting into the bid evaluation piece of it. Although looking at the way the law is written, it says bid application requirements and a bid evaluation methodology. So we do have to make sure the objective is set, and whether we can, kind of keep the same methodology is maybe an open question on how we interpret the law. Should the agency consider an approach that takes bids out, purely at a price order, to prioritize bids that support a higher number of equity eligible contractors or that direct a larger proportion of project revenue toward equity eligible contractors? So in that case, we're looking at some of the qualitative aspects of what's traditionally been our Part 1 application in the competitive procurement process, and using those for scoring bids as part of Part 2. So we'd love any feedback on this. I think John had some thoughts earlier that were really interesting, especially if there's anything that's worked really well in other states or other similar contexts, maybe non-energy contexts, about how you accomplish economic efficiency, or at least most cost effectively use a capped amount of funds while at the same time achieving these very important and worthy objectives. We'd love feedback on that.
No questions or comments in the chat right now.
Great, let's move on to the next two slides then. So this next question is written somewhat narrowly, but I'm actually going to try, let me try to broaden it a little bit, I think, based upon some of what I've heard so far. So we'll be setting up an equity accountability system, and there will be requirements for participants in our procurements and programs to participate in it and to report on what they're doing to hire eligible persons. But there is also a process to allow for waivers. So if entities can't find people, how, that they can get some waivers for their goals that they have to achieve. And the law specifies some very specific provisions in terms of what they can do to achieve that waiver. If there'll be an energy workforce equity database that will be set up, will be a place to help sort of search for workers and things like that. One of the challenges I think we've seen on things like this is, how do you think about something like waivers? Because we want to meet the goals and the spirits of the law, which is to create a more diverse and equitable workforce in the renewable energy industry. On the other hand, there are actual challenges that can come up with meeting those goals. It can be geographic, it can be other issues. So the broad question here really is, within the confines of what's set out in the new provisions of the IPA Act around the equity accountability system, what is the right set of balances in terms of meeting the spirit of the law, but also understanding the practical and pragmatic aspects of allowing for waivers for when contractors are not able to meet their goals? And how basically where's the sweet spot of finding sort of the rigidity of that versus the flexibility that's needed? Can we go on to the next? If there are no comments on this, can we go on to the next slide? So I mentioned this briefly before. One provision of the Act now also has us conducting a study of racial disparity and discrimination that focuses on the equity action system that's being developed, and look at and it creates the window for us to take that system and make proposed modifications in the future for it. So I think this is actually, I find the model here really interesting, because we sometimes find ourselves in the box that, obviously, as we all know, passing legislation can be very difficult and time consuming, but you learn over time things that work and don't work. And if you have provisions hard coded into the law, you can, and you're finding something that there's a little bit of a pinch point there, you can have some challenges there. So what I find intriguing about this process is that we have a pretty clearly set out system for the equity accountability system set out in law, but we are given the tool of being able to conduct a study looking at whether or not it's achieving the goals that it's intended, and being able to propose changes to that system through future long-term plans. So that's sort of a high level issue here. Some specific things, and this is sort of getting down into the weeds of where we as an agency have to think about in terms of implementation, is the way it's set out in the law is that the equity accountability system requirements do not start until the delivery year after the plan is approved. So as I mentioned earlier, the long-term plan that we're developing now will get approved in July of 2022. That the next energy delivery year starts June 1, 2023. So that's the point at which those requirements will begin to kick in. And then we're supposed to publish a study within a year of when contracts start being awarded from that system. So I think there's a number of timing issues here that we're interested in feedback on, because one challenge that we see is, obviously we want to see what's working and what's not working and look at that, but sometimes things take time, especially with renewable energy projects. While there's some that can be developed and built quickly, other projects can take a year, 2 years, with the delays we've seen obviously recently, sometimes even longer than that. So what is the right timing of thinking about at what point do we have enough information and data about what's working and what's not working that we should be thinking about changes? Are there interim reports to study that we should consider? And then also, what sort of data collection requirements have we maybe not thought about in a separate stakeholder feedback process for the reopening of the adjustable block program? We had a stakeholder feedback request about what demographic data we collect in that program. We got some really helpful feedback, and we're in the process of sort of revising that. But it'd be helpful to have feedback, because again, this is something new for our agency on what is the key data to collect around a study like this. The other thing that would be helpful, again, because this is new ground for us, is what can we do to prepare for a study like this? We are given pretty broad authority in the legislation in terms of hiring outside consultants to conduct the studies. And my understanding that there is a industry of companies that conduct studies like this for public entities. So, but again, as this is new to us, any insight and experience people might have that could help us plan for this, for preparing the study and the hiring of a consultant to prepare a study like this would be very much appreciated. So with that, if there are any questions or comments on either of these topics, you take them now.
We have one comment just on the disparity study, suggesting that IPA do a baseline study on equity showing the current practices, and then a study post 2023 looking at the before and after effect.
That's a helpful thought. I think one challenge we've sometimes seen is that due to the nature of the renewable energy industry, and is that there can be multiple actors involved in any given project. And so who has data about all those sorts of things can sometimes be a little difficult to collect. And the extent to which we set up expectations of what information needs to be gathered up front, that certainly makes it a lot easier. It can be much more difficult after the fact, going back and trying to collect data on projects afterwards. But to the extent we can gather that, I think that is definitely an interesting idea.
Okay, and then we have an additional commenter who'd like to be unmuted so that she can ask her question directly.
Okay, great.
Mega, let me see if I can do it.
Sarah, what is her name? I can unmute her.
Hillary Scott Ogunrend. I'm not sure if I'm
Yeah.
pronouncing the last name correctly.
Yes. Hi, thank you
Hi.
for unmuting me. Yeah, I just wanted to make a comment regarding the possible solutions or anecdotal information surrounding what could be done in an effort to make sure workforce goals and minority participation or equity provisions were implemented. So as it relates to a waiver or demonstrating if the contractor had a good faith effort, if they could receive the waiver, or if they had definitely demonstrated that they had established a pre-apprenticeship program or connected with organizations where apprenticeship program was implemented, but yet they still fell short, and then also establishing joint ventures or mentor-protege relationships in an effort to meet the business, the BIPOC equity enterprise goals. So I think if an entity would have met or attempted both of those things and still fell short, then yes, a waiver would be in line.
Thank you. That's really helpful. If you could submit written comments on that, because again, this is new territory for us, and thinking about those sorts of criteria really helpful. The law is pretty narrow. While it does grant waivers, there is language to the effect that we're really looking at them on a project specific basis, and that we are supposed to look at if similar applicants have had been able to meet similar commitments. So I think there's definitely language in the act that to me is meant to anticipate making sure not letting this get too broad. So I think that's consistent with what you're suggesting.
Okay, there's nothing else at this time.
Okay, great. Let's move on to the next section. So we're going to change gears a bit here and talk about REC prices. And this is only in the context of our programs where REC prices are administratively set, rather than competitive procurements where REC prices are set through a bidding process. And so we're going to talk more this afternoon about the adjustable block program and the Illinois Solar for All program, but I wanted to spend some time on a more technical aspect of how we think about the rec prices for those programs. There'll be questions this afternoon that will circle back to some of the themes brought up this morning, but this is sort of a little bit more of a focused look at this. Next slide, please. So at a high level, the way we approached pricing renewable energy credits for the adjustable block program and the Illinois Solar for All program was through using something called the CREST model that was developed by NREL, one of the national labs. And it's a model that gives you what's known as a levelized cost of electricity. Basically, what revenue would a system need in order to be economically viable? And it's a industry fairly well known tool, which was, and when we were first developing the program back in 2017 and 2018, so the stakeholder feedback recommended using that as a starting point. We paired that with looking at what revenue a system would get from net metering and what portion that would be captured by the customer versus the revenue that the developer installer of the system would need. And we paired those things together and developed a model that basically looked at the difference between sort of the expected cost and the expected revenue and used that delta to be the value that the renewable energy credits would need to cover, and that's looking at a 15-year production of a system, what rec price would be needed depending on the size of the system, whether it was a community solar project or a distributed generation project. Again, a bunch of different models to look at that, and we use that then to develop the prices that have been used to date in the adjustable block program and the Illinois Solar for All program. In the adjustable block program, the model based upon what we'd seen in other states was one where we had certain set blocks of capacity, and then as a block filled, the price would decline 4% for the next block. And that's what we worked through in the initial phase of the program until things had to close because of the funding constraints that existed until CEJA was enacted. When we developed the second revised long-term plan, that's the one that we published for stakeholder comment this summer, we decided it was time to do a refresh of the values and not just sort of continue that 4% decline. Take a look at, if we updated some of the assumptions going into it, what would the rec prices look like? And in that plan, we published both what next block's prices would look like if we continue the 4% decline, as well as a preliminary analysis of an updated set of prices. And unfortunately, because that plan was then withdrawn before we received stakeholder feedback, we did not receive that feedback, and we think this would be a helpful time to circle back to some of those questions and we had as we developed that model, and think about that, as well as looking at new items of consideration because of some of the changes that now exist because of CEJA. One thing I want to note here is that when the adjustable block program opens again on December 14th, the prices that will exist for those blocks that open on December 14th are statutorily set. So what we're talking about here is not those sets of prices, but through this development of the long-term plan, what will be the next prices for future blocks. And this afternoon, we'll be talking a bit about timing and block sizes of what that all looks like. So again, everything we're talking about here should be thinking about stuff that won't even be relevant until July of next year at the earliest. Next slide, please. So just a little context on what we had in the long-term plan. This is the chart for the plan of our proposed our preliminary rec pricing model update. This was modeling that was conducted this past summer. We basically just updated a number of inputs, and I'll go through a few of those following slides. One thing I want to emphasize is these were merely, as you can see, preliminary prices. These prices never went into effect. We never received stakeholder feedback. We obviously did not open blocks based upon that plan. So again, I definitely want to emphasize that this is a modeling exercise that we're looking to refine to move towards what will ultimately be the prices that will be used. If you want to understand better all the details of this, the link that's listed on the slide will bring you to what's known as Appendix D and Appendix E of the withdrawn second revised plan. Appendix D is a detailed description of the model and includes a lot of information about the inputs that went into it. Appendix E is a set of spreadsheets that are used to actually calculate the REC price. It's the NREL CREST model with our additional tabs added onto that to take the output of that model and translate them into REC prices. One thing that got very complicated for us as we developed the plan over the summer was we had different spreadsheets for each different category of the adjustable block program and subprogram of Illinois Solar for All. One thing we are working on for the next plan is a new version of the spreadsheet that will be able to consolidate that all down into one spreadsheet that should be a lot more user-friendly than I believe it was the 16 spreadsheets that we published over the summer. So for those of you who have dived into those spreadsheets, I believe what we'll be publishing with the next, with the draft plan will be a lot more easy to go into, and all the assumptions and inputs of it will be consolidated, and looking at the variations will be easier to see. Next slide. So there's some specific things, and again, a lot of this we can maybe talk a little bit at a high level about this, but ultimately these are the sorts of things that are going to really lend themselves to written comments. And again, at the beginning of the workshop, I mentioned that when you submit written comments, you can choose to submit confidential comments as well, along with a public version of it. So if we're getting into anything around specific cost data from specific entities, I absolutely understand why that data may need to be treated confidentially. So this is the sort of feedback I was thinking about when I brought that up earlier. So when we developed the model that we included in the withdrawn second revised plan, what we did is we updated the federal tax credit to 26% from the 30% that had been in the original model. Now, obviously, I appreciate that there's still ongoing debate in Washington about the future of that tax credit and what it will look like, and we will, need to take that into account if changes are enacted at the federal level in time for us to take those into consideration. We also updated some of the cost assumptions going into it from a national cost benchmarking study. And I know there's been a lot of concern lately about a variety of increasing costs. So we're very interested in inputs, in feedback on the assumptions from national studies that are a little bit older and how those correlate to what people are actually seeing on the ground. Another major change we made as we updated the REC pricing model was the DC to AC ratio. We had made some assumptions about that based upon stakeholder feedback when we were first developing the long-term plan, but we took a look at actual applications that have been received by the adjustable block program now that we have thousands and thousands of applications, and refined those AC-DC ratios based upon that data. We obviously refreshed net metering values, and then we did a bit of a survey of community solar projects on community solar interconnection costs, which we understand has been a very difficult issue for many developers, and that the assumptions we had made about the interconnection costs were not necessarily what entities were actually seeing in real life. So we updated those numbers. So we're very interested in all of those assumptions and the extent to which, what assumptions we made need to further refreshing or other inputs added to it. A couple other things I wanted to focus in on that would be that we also started using capacity factors, the translation of the project size to the expected energy and thus REC production. Again, we use the data from the applications received to get more granular on capacity factors. I believe when we developed the initial model, we basically used one capacity factor for community solar and one for distributed generation. Now we have that much more granular. So the extent to which developers look at those numbers in each group and each size category and see if they, if there's any anomalies in our data that skew those one way or other, that would be very helpful to understand. Another challenge we had is, while to date, basically almost all the community solar we've seen has been large projects with the interest in community-driven community solar and potentially smaller projects in other sorts of locations. One of the things we started thinking about would be, do those projects look more like a distributed generation project? Are they more likely, for example, to be a roof mounted and therefore and not have tracking systems? And so we use distributed generation data as a proxy for the capacity factors for community, smaller size community solar. That seemed like a reasonable assumption, but we're very interested in feedback on whether or not that assumption is in fact accurate. I already alluded to the interconnection costs for community solar projects. I'm sure we'll get a lot of feedback on that, and we really want to understand that better. Another thing that would be helpful is we really focused on sort of cost inputs. There are a number of other assumptions within the CREST model. There's assumptions about debt ratios, there's internal rates of returns, there's a number of fields for operations and maintenance costs. We did not update any of those in the refresh we did over the summer. So the extent to which stakeholders can look at those assumptions within the CREST model, again, this is all, probably most easily found by looking at the Appendix D to the withdrawn plan. That would be very helpful to sort of say, it's a time to sort of refresh the assumptions about the financing structures. Let's go on through a couple more slides, then we can circle back to these in terms of comments, because I think those are the sort of open issues that we had from the modeling we did over the summer. But if we can go to the next slide. We now have new considerations because we have a new law that makes a number of changes, and we now need to think about how to factor those in. So one to flag right away is that in the initial model, we had a single price for projects up to 10 kilowatts, and then a series of sort of price bins for the larger distributed generation projects from anything that could be anywhere from 10 kilowatts up to 2 megawatts. So a couple of things happen now with the change in law. First, the small distributed generation category is for projects up to 25 kilowatts. And then also the maximum size of distributed generation projects and community solar projects over a longer run will increase to 5 megawatts. So this raises a couple issues. First, do we want to continue to have a single price for small distributed generation projects? In other words, for projects from 0 to 25, well, not, I guess not 0, but whatever this, a very small project up to 25 kilowatts, or do we want to do like we've done for the large distributed generation for community solar, have multiple price bins? So for example, we could maintain the 10 kW breakpoint to have a price for small DG projects up to 10 kW and another price for projects 10 kW to 25 kW that would recognize some of the economies of scale that happen as projects get larger. So that's one consideration. On the other side of the spectrum, now that projects go up to 5 megawatts, right? How much granularity should we do in pricing bins? I mean, where are the breakpoints on economies of scale as projects get larger? And in other words, should there be breakpoints between? Right now, I believe we go from 500 kilowatts to 2 megawatts is all one price bin. What if any, should be the breakpoints between 2 megawatts and 5 megawatts? And the extent to which there can be industry experience on that would be really helpful. There are also a number of changes to net metering that took place through CEJA. And so we're interested in what assumptions should we make about net metering and how should those change as a result of those. As part of the opening of the adjustable block program, we had issued a request for stakeholder feedback on the cost of complying with prevailing wage, and we got some helpful comments on that we're working through for the opening of the adjustable block program. But we're, I think, interested in ongoing feedback on that topic, and are there other significant cost adjustments that maybe should be considered have not yet been reflected? Next slide. Other considerations are we now have 3 new categories in the adjustable block program: a category for public schools, a category for community-driven community solar, and a category for equity-eligible contractor projects. What are the cost considerations unique to each of those 3 categories that we should consider that are maybe not reflected in the way we've approached modeling REC prices to date? A subset of that would be, we have not, other than the small subscriber adder for community solar, we have not used adders to date. We've had sort of size category adjustments. As we expand these new categories, are there potentially things where we should think about adders to rec prices for projects that have certain attributes? The easy example, of course, would be thinking about the difference between a rooftop or ground-mounted community solar project and the implications of costs there, but there might be others as well. Another thing we're interested in feedback on is that there's now a 50% minimum commitment for small subscribers for projects. So at this point, is the idea of a small subscriber adder now stale because we have a minimum requirement? And instead, should we be focusing in on how subscriber management and acquisition costs are factored into the baseline prices of community solar rather than approaching small subscribers as an adder? Hinted at this already a little bit. In general, while we expect community-driven community solar projects are likely to be smaller size projects, that's not necessarily the case, and that's what we've thought about in terms of where the rec prices for those projects would be higher. But are there other aspects of a community-driven project that might make those projects a little less economically efficient? Again, by focusing on residents only in certain geographic areas that would have an impact on subscriber acquisition because the net you can cast is smaller. So are there other things we should be looking at in terms of thinking about community-driven community solar? And then finally, there are changes that to the law that now allow for the billing of community solar subscription fees through the utility rather than on a separate bill. So that is something that did not previously exist, and that is something that we believe would lower subscriber management costs for community solar projects. But any feedback we could get about how that option makes things more efficient and lowers costs, and how that should be factored into our considerations of renewable energy credit pricing for community solar projects would be greatly appreciated. So I know I covered a whole range of topics there, but some of these things will again lend themselves more to written feedback, but to the extent that there are questions or comments at a high level, or if anyone's ready to get into details, happy to take those as well.
Thanks, Anthony. We had one question that another attendee partly addressed. Kim Knowles asked about the CREST model and what the costs include in that model. Ben Paulus directed her and the rest of the group to the NREL site that provides more information on that model, but I don't know if you wanted to add anything to that, just a high level to give an idea.
Yeah, I mean, it's designed to be an all-in model. And if you look again at Appendix D to either the original plan or the now withdrawn second revised plan, in that you can see the sort of cost categories that it breaks out. Off the top of my head, I not remember exactly what they are, but there's like 5 or 6 cost categories that go into it, and that as we look at costs, they sort of have to be ultimately compiled so that they can fit into the inputs of the model. And that is something that can sometimes be a little difficult to ascertain.
Okay, that was the only question at this time.
Great, can we go to the next slide then? So at this point, we're having our afternoon session where we're going to focus in on the adjustable block program, the Illinois Solar Fall program, and consumer protections. But this is also an opportunity now. We're running a little ahead of schedule. If anyone has any questions or comments about the content covered this morning, this would be the time to provide that.
We had one question just about posting this afterwards, but no substantive questions so far. Maybe we can give it another few minutes.
Sounds good. And again, reminder, our afternoon session will start at 1 o'clock. And written comments are due December 3rd. And on the screen is the email address to send those comments to.
Not seeing any other questions come in.
Okay, great. Well, then let's wrap things up. Again, we may have time this afternoon if there's things that people think about or as they eat lunch that they wanted to ask. If we have time at the end of the afternoon session, we can certainly circle back to those at that time. And again, obviously, you can submit written comments as well. So with that, I'd like to thank everyone for participating this morning. And we will see you again at 1 o'clock for the afternoon session. Thank you.